Paso entonces al primer panel de este Congreso Internacional, que se titula La relevancia de ser una potencia marítima y que será moderada por el director ejecutivo de Antena Lab, el señor Juan Pablo Toro, a quien pido recibamos con un aplauso.
Muy buenos días, señores almirantes, señores oficiales de Armadas Amigas y gente ligada a la industria marítima y naval y amigos todos que están aquí presentes reunidos. Es para nosotros un honor participar en la ExpoNaval, feria a la cual yo vengo asistiendo hace años, entonces ya estar en este lado es bastante diferente. Y desde un primer momento de que nos constituimos como Antena Lab, siempre pensamos que uno de nuestros nortes tenía que ser, ¿cierto?, apoyar la creación de una conciencia marítima en Chile. Algo tan importante, nos hablaba al principio Rodrigo Lobo, nos decía, bueno, por geografía es lógico que seamos un país marítimo. Tenemos territorios en 3 continentes, en Antártica, en la Oceanía, en Latinoamérica. Por comercio, también deberíamos ser un país marítimo. Ambas realidades son bastante elocuentes. Sin embargo, por alguna razón, no lo somos. Y este panel, entre otros objetivos, tiene el propósito de que destacadas personalidades nos cuenten los desafíos que significa ser una potencia, en el mejor de los casos, o un país marítimo, o una nación marítima, si queremos, en este siglo XXI, que es un siglo eminentemente marítimo. Hemos visto, ¿cierto?, en los últimos tiempos, de algún modo, quizás de una manera traumática, cómo la guerra de Ucrania, ¿cierto?, por lo menos, se ha expresado también en el aspecto naval. Entonces, hemos entendido la importancia de la infraestructura que está bajo el mar, ¿cierto? Los cables submarinos que han sufrido o los gasoductos que han sufrido disrupciones. También hemos visto la importancia de mantener las líneas marítimas comerciales abiertas, porque hemos visto bloqueos de puertos, ¿cierto?, en el Mar Negro. Entonces, todo eso que parecía sacado de los libros de teoría, en un par de meses se hace realidad. Y al hacerse realidad, yo creo que es más fácil, estos ejemplos frescos nos sirven justamente para crear esta conciencia marítima y la importancia de contar con marinas que tengan capacidades propias, ¿cierto?, que puedan trabajar o interoperar con otras marinas y potenciarse y lograr los efectos en el mar de forma combinada, como nos decía el almirante Noonan. Así que, para dar paso a este panel, yo los voy a dejar en primer lugar con el vicealmirante Martin Connell. Él es el Second Sea Lord de la Armada del Reino Unido, la Royal Navy, ¿cierto?, una armada con la cual tenemos vínculos desde la época de la independencia. Tenemos un héroe en común, tenemos Lord Cochrane, es un héroe en común, ¿cierto?, un buque nuestro, que es una fragata, por supuesto, de origen británico, lleva su nombre, y muchas de las tradiciones de esa marina son hoy día tradiciones que consideramos propias, ¿cierto? Tenemos también gente que entrena ya, se forma ya, entonces la verdad que el vínculo no puede ser más estrecho. Posteriormente tenemos a un gran amigo, Fernando Wilson, profesor de la Academia de Guerra Naval, uno de los mayores expertos en temas marítimos en Chile, a quien tengo el gusto de conocer hace mucho tiempo porque estuvimos juntos en la universidad, así que no vamos a contar hace cuánto tiempo lo conozco y también nos va a dar la perspectiva chilena, que es muy importante también conocerla aquí. Y finalmente, Alessio Patalano, él es profesor académico, ¿cierto?, y tiene su PhD. Él trabaja en el King's College de Londres, que reúne a los principales navalistas del mundo. Alessio es su primera vez en Chile, así que ha sido una oportunidad no solo para hablar con ustedes, sino para darle a conocer también a la Armada cómo funciona y la realidad de nuestro país. Así que también él que ha estado, la verdad, él ha estado recorriendo el Indo-Pacífico todo este año, ¿cierto? Estuvo en Japón, hizo una leve escala en Londres para recordarle a su familia que él todavía existe y después se vino a Chile, ¿no? Pero nos vimos en Australia ahí en la conferencia del Indo-Pacífico que organizó el almirante Noonan. Entonces, él también tiene toda esta experiencia fresca para comparar cómo los distintos países se están posicionando en este momento y asumiendo el desafío de ser una nación marítima en el siglo XXI. Así que en nombre de la Antena Lab, muchas gracias, un honor estar aquí y doy la palabra al vicealmirante Martin Connell. Admiral, you have the con, please.
Juan Pablo, thank you. Admirals, distinguished guests, good morning. It's a real privilege for me as the Royal Navy's Second Sea Lord to be here in Valparaiso for ExpoNaval. I recognize and appreciate the depth and the breadth of our two nations' respective histories, which extend back hundreds of years, but in the sense of our navies, just over 200 years. And I've long realized that when it comes to friends and allies, we should always choose wisely. In 1732, John Pullen, who then was the former governor of Bermuda, wrote in his memoirs, he says of Chile, and I quote, "They are a people of the bravest and most martial of any in all the Americas." Now that will certainly do for me. I have 5 substantive points that I wish to offer in terms of relevance this morning for what it means for the Royal Navy to be a maritime power. And I say so as a practitioner, someone whose Navy is enacting this on a day-to-day basis. Firstly, the global maritime commons. Building on what Admiral Noonan said earlier, the rules-based system has served us well for decades. It is, though, occasionally challenged, but I have yet to hear of a more credible alternative. And unfortunately, security and adherence to such a system is not universally accepted. International rules of the road have emerged to formalize the use of the maritime environment. It is a system, an understanding, an environment that we recognize as being critical to uphold and protect. UNCLOS is one manifestation of this, ratified by 164 UN member states, and it obliges member states to act. In our globalized and interconnected world, global security requires maritime security, and never has it been more important. Security of this sector, these commons, now extends increasingly below the waves, facilitating an increasingly vital e-commerce, and it is becoming increasingly congested, challenged, and contested. Secondly, is the importance and criticality of alliances. We are no longer in a unipolar or bipolar world. There are numerous regional spheres of influence, and multilateralism is not consistently assured or applied. And as we are seeing on the European continent with the illegal war in Ukraine, having friends and allies matters. Going solo is simply not conducive to long-term success. And sovereign nations must choose carefully which side of history they wish to side with. And these relationships are deeply important to navies. The golden thread running through our alliances, partnerships, and friendships is a shared endeavor and desire for peace, security, and prosperity for the benefit of all. Maritime powers, I suggest, need to strive for interoperability and increasingly interchangeability, and that takes time and effort and trust. And as practitioners, we know you cannot surge that trust when an operation arises. When we deployed our newest aircraft carrier, HMS Queen Elizabeth, on her inaugural operational deployment last year, we did so deliberately with some of our closest allies from the outset, namely the United States Navy, the United States Marine Corps, and the Royal Netherlands Navy. And for this initial operational deployment, the task group sailed across 3 oceans and 5 seas, sailing over 40,000 miles with a squadron of combat-ready United States Marine Corps F-35Bs fully integrated into the ship and task group, capable of mounting sovereign or combined operations at immediate readiness. Done correctly, this acts as a true force multiplier, but it is dependent on trust, confidence, and continued investment in times of relative peace and stability. And importantly, this is an instrument of national power. At a time when the United Kingdom was being viewed as retreating, certainly from the European Union, we deployed a multinational task group to the other side of the world during a global pandemic. Thirdly is the importance of innovating. Maritime powers must continually adapt. It does, of course, take years to build a nuclear submarine or a complex warship. And as navies, we expect them to be in operational service for 20 or 30 years, sometimes much longer. So we need to be able to continually build in new capabilities. Because in this increasingly democratized technology world, anyone can buy virtually anything, and capabilities can quickly become obsolete. And we're now seeing rapid growth in high-end warfighting capabilities: stealth, precision, weaponized drones, hypersonics, cyber bombs. These are all the new reality that navies have to contend with. We therefore need systems and processes which get emerging technology into the hands of our operators, our sailors, faster. And we need to provide the clarity, the thought leadership, and collaborative behaviors to enable our industry partners to help us develop the most innovative and game-changing ideas. In the Royal Navy, I am increasingly seeking to delatch capabilities we seek from their platforms, which traditionally for some time have been hardwired. We're developing a modular approach in order to drive flexibility, efficiency, and mass. And as we embrace autonomy, analytics, AI, and synthetics, we will need different skills in our people, but the prize will be increased productivity and effectiveness and less risk. Fourthly, in terms of adaptability and flexibility, and while I've focused on some of the warfighting aspects of being a maritime power, it's important to reflect that in relevant terms, maritime powers are capable of the full spectrum of maritime operations. In fact, much of my career has been spent on constabulary-type operations, enforcing trade embargoes or United Nations resolutions, ensuring fish stocks aren't depleted, saving lives at sea, prosecuting piracy and criminal networks, and surveying oceans. All of these functions have been a part of my naval career to varying degrees, as well as the need to be prepared for high-end peer-on-peer warfighting. And that ability to flex rapidly across the full spectrum of operations from maritime security to humanitarian assistance and back again is a key attribute of a responsible maritime power. In 1835, Robert Fitzroy in HMS Beagle was surveying the coasts just off Chile, and they witnessed an earthquake hit the city of Concepcion. And immediately, he and his crew, without seeking permission, including Charles Darwin, were able to render assistance in the immediate aftermath. And it was from there, later that same year, that HMS Beagle sailed for the Galapagos Islands, where Darwin would begin to develop the ideas which would be given expression in 1859 in his seminal On the Origin of Species. And the most recent example of such action by my Navy was earlier this year on the 26th of January, our newest offshore patrol vessel operating on the other side of the world, HMS Spey delivered critical humanitarian support to the people of Tonga in the wake of a catastrophic tsunami, and I'm proud that on this occasion, it was the first Allied ship on the scene. And finally, and importantly, there is an inextricable link to economic prosperity. In the United Kingdom, we are enjoying the biggest recapitalization of our Navy in a generation. And even with commercial competition, it is driving in private capital investment and creating thousands of skilled jobs in and around the regions of the United Kingdom. And over 50% of that investment is spent in the United Kingdom's supply chain, which equals growth, prosperity, and social value important to our political leaders. And that in turn drives sustainable streams for future shipbuilding. We need to learn the lessons of stop-start shipbuilding of the past. And that will open up opportunities for defense and commerce in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Admiral, for your presentation. Now, Fernando Wilson, profesor de la Academia de Guerra Naval, va a iniciar su presentación. Gracias, Fernando.
Bien, antes que nada, no pretendo torturarlos con mi inglés oxidado, así que haré esta presentación en castellano. Agradecer tanto a la Academia de Guerra Naval como a los organizadores de esta presentación, de este seminario y de esta exposición, el poder estar acá. Al igual que mencionaba hace un momento atrás el presentador, yo también soy un asistente de décadas a esta feria y el hecho de poder estar en este momento en esta presentación representa un honor y un milestone interesante en lo que es el desarrollo de mi carrera profesional. En el caso de hoy vamos a presentar esencialmente lo que podríamos definir como las características o desarrollo del carácter marítimo o la visión marítima de Chile. Lo que ustedes comprenderán en 20 minutos es bastante complejo, por lo tanto serán solamente algunos brochazos generales que desarrollaremos en ese sentido. En ese punto, y el almirante Noonan ya desarrollaba con bastante más precisión de la que puedo aspirar en este momento a hacer yo, ¿qué es lo que es una potencia marítima? Quedémonos simplemente como aquella situación o aquel caso en el cual el mar provee un elemento considerable de las estructuras del poder nacional de una sociedad. Pero esto tiene al mismo tiempo, en paralelo, una condición de orden cualitativo, blanda, que es la percepción y comprensión de dicha circunstancia por parte de la sociedad dentro de la cual estas circunstancias funcionan. Como conversábamos con el almirante Noonan hace algunos momentos atrás y también lo presentaba en su propia exposición hace algunos momentos atrás, nos encontramos en el caso chileno también con la paradoja de que, siendo un país predominantemente marítimo, por lejos el más consciente de dicha condición de América Latina, sin embargo, nuestra cultura nacional, nuestra sociedad ha elegido consolidar su simbología básicamente en la visión del mundo rural del Valle Central del siglo XIX. El 18 de septiembre se celebra básicamente en una evocación del mundo rural y no del mundo marítimo, cuestión paradojal como podremos presentar en algunos momentos más. En esa situación nos encontramos, por tanto, con la gran duda que Andrew Lambert y tantos otros autores nos han presentado, que es qué es lo que constituye o qué es lo que configura a una nación marítima, a un Estado marítimo. En el caso chileno en particular es la dualidad de culturas locales características por la geografía que determina nuestra sociedad, pero también la fuerte necesidad que se desarrolla de forma paradojal en nuestras etapas de la independencia y las aspiraciones de conexión global que son determinantes hasta el día de hoy en la construcción de nuestra sociedad. En esa situación, la independencia reconoce un elemento fundamental en términos de que mientras se desarrolla la fase final del Imperio Español en América, el caso chileno resulta anómalo y paradojal. Mientras los recursos de poder nacional del Imperio Español se concentraban en la defensa de las vías marítimas de comunicaciones del Caribe y del Golfo de México, con gigantescas obras de fortificación como en Santiago de Cuba, La Habana, Cartagena de Indias, Portobelo, Veracruz, etc., el caso del sur quedaba más bien dejado al secreto. La decisión de la corona española, no contando con los recursos para fortificar el sur, fue más bien de privar de conocimiento a los navegantes europeos de las condiciones de mar, vientos prevalecientes, fondeaderos, etcétera, que pudiesen ayudar efectivamente al cruce oceánico y a la visita de nuestras costas. Y eso puede ser visto claramente en este mapa, donde se presentan las rutas marítimas primarias del Imperio Español y Portugués durante el siglo XVIII, donde ustedes podrán notar que, si bien es cierto el Cabo de Horno figura, la costa chilena es un enorme vacío. La corona española prefería evitar antes que tener que gastar en las fortificaciones. Y tendría toda la razón. Apenas Jacobo Lermit confirmó la existencia del archipiélago Juan Fernández, descubierto más de un siglo antes por la corona española, confirmó que existía agua dulce y ganado en pie. Pocos años después tenemos la visita de Lord Anson, quien, después de una complejísimo cruce del Cabo de Hornos en pleno invierno, se asienta en estas islas durante 6 meses antes de desarrollar operaciones en la cuenca del Pacífico español. La fortificación posterior de Juan Fernández de Valdivia, también ocupada por los holandeses brevemente durante el siglo XVIII, marcará más bien una visión reactiva a la cual la élite chilena resintió fuertemente. Chile recibía al año del orden de 5 a 7 navíos de registro, buques que traían comercio desde Callao o Guayaquil. Incluso más, solo se permitía exportar trigo, grasa de animales y vino en odres con el pelo hacia adentro para obligarlo a ser procesado en otros lugares. Esa situación generó en la élite chilena una ambición de conexión mundial que va a ser particularmente manifiesta durante la vuelta del siglo XVIII al XIX. El hambre de saber qué había más allá. Y esto queda reflejado en solo 2 ejemplos brutales. La incidencia o el impacto del contrabando en la llegada de libros a Chile, un magnífico trabajo del Departamento de Historia de la Universidad Católica mostró cómo en las bibliotecas de Santiago y Concepción se leían textos, aparte de prohibidos por el índex, que estaban presentes en densidades tanto numéricas como de complejidad mucho mayores a otras sociedades latinoamericanas. David Ricardo, Adam Smith, Hume, Locke eran leídos en forma regular. Otra cosa es que se los entendiera, pero de que se los leía, estaban ahí. Y finalmente, el hecho de que nada menos que el gobernador de Chile y posteriormente virrey del Perú, Ambrosio Higgins, irlandés católico, expulsado de Gran Bretaña por su religión, sin embargo, envía a su hijo, Bernardo, reconocido ya como Higgins, no al besamanos a Madrid, sino que precisamente a Richmond, a Londres, donde precisamente conozca las vías del mundo, como lo expresaría en una de sus cartas, y no simplemente las redes de contactos políticos que otros españoles buscaban en el período. A través de esa situación y con la presencia que nos encontramos acá, no es casualidad que la independencia en Chile tuviera un sinónimo permanente, el libre comercio, que era otro nombre para lo que hoy día llamamos globalización. La aspiración de interconexión global que determinaría estos primeros años de nuestra República. Eso llevaría a la construcción tras el triunfo de los conservadores en Lircay en 1830 y la estabilidad que entregará la Constitución del 33, las 3 décadas de la República Conservadora, Prieto, Bulnes y Montt, de lo que se recibiría el nombre del Emporio del Pacífico, nombre acuñado por Sergio Villalobos y Eduardo Cavieres en sus obras seminales sobre el comercio temprano republicano chileno. Valparaíso se convierte de esa forma en una plataforma comercial donde se abre la primera bolsa de valores de la cuenca del Pacífico, los almacenes francos donde carga puede ser depositada sin ser internada, por lo tanto repartida y transportada a través de toda la cuenca del Pacífico, las exportaciones de trigo, harina y posteriormente minerales se extienden por toda la cuenca del Pacífico, posteriormente también Europa, inaugurando una plataforma y una vocación eminentemente globalizante a través del mar. En ese sentido, no podemos separar las 2 caras del poder marítimo, el sea power, en su definición majaniana más pura, en términos de que la autoridad que representaba la administración y el gobierno en Valparaíso, el intendente, era a la vez ministro de Comercio y a la vez comandante general de Marina. Hablemos de triple hatting, digamos, y de asignación combinada de autoridad de concentrar en una sola estructura la visión y la conexión internacional de Chile. No es casualidad tampoco que la Bolsa de Valores, cuando se trasladó a su local en calle Prat, cediera el sitio donde estaba ubicada para la construcción del actual monumento a la Marina, la cripta de Prat y los héroes de Iquique, digamos, ratificando esta conexión, esta dualidad. En ese sentido, la construcción de redes en este esquema se combinará desde la perspectiva de la creación de un distrito comercial y un distrito naval. Culminada la independencia larga con la victoria en la guerra contra la Confederación Peruano-Boliviana en 1839, el primer acto de la República es tomar posesión del Estrecho de Magallanes, el control de los pasos interoceánicos australes. Y establecido Magallanes y orientada el poder naval chileno, sin ninguna ley de por medio, sino que con una comprensión intuitiva, fluida, flexible, de una función de control del mar, militar, naval, a una función constabulary de pacificación, control, hidrografía, abastecimiento de ese asentamiento magallánico, digamos primero Fuerte Bulnes, posteriormente Punta Arenas. Tenemos luego la construcción de la marina mercante, distintas fases exportadoras que irán evolucionando a través del siglo XIX, marcando de esa forma una visión netamente marítima. No es casualidad, por tanto, que Chile, un país que a la sazón contaba con 3 millones de habitantes, pudiera sentarse a la mesa con gigantes del tamaño de Brasil o Argentina en la firma de los pactos del ABC de 1915. Chile se había convertido en potencia no en virtud de sus factores continentales, sino que en virtud precisamente del uso efectivo y eficiente del sea power. Y en ese sentido podemos ver no solamente la costa, sino que esta magnífica foto del estudio Curré, que nos muestra cómo en 3 kilómetros cuadrados el sea power chileno se manifestaba de una manera brutal. No les puedo negar que mi primera inclinación fue traer una imagen de la magnífica escuadra de cruceros, digamos, de la Vuelta del Siglo o del acorazado Almirante La Torre, el único super dreadnought del hemisferio sur. Pero esta imagen en particular lo resume de una manera brillante. Tenemos el gran edificio de los almacenes francos, inmediatamente abajo la Bolsa de Valores, y arriba las primeras construcciones de lo que sería posteriormente la Escuela Naval. La combinación en una sola imagen de la referencia al compromiso del Estado chileno con el poder naval. ¿Qué decir de las lanchas necesarias para el desembarco de la carga en la época de la vela? Los veleros no atracaban a muelle, digamos, y que resumían la principal concentración de poder económico de la cuenca del Pacífico en la década del 1870 y 1880. Avanzando en esta situación, nos encontramos con que, de alguna manera, la crisis del 29 es el final de esta primera etapa. La crisis del 29 deja a Chile, al menos según los registros por la Liga de las Naciones, como el país más afectado del mundo. Perdemos el 67% del Producto Geográfico Bruto, el 94% de nuestras exportaciones. El colapso, básicamente, de la economía del salitre. Eso hace que Chile se vuelva sobre sí mismo, adopte una postura temerosa respecto al mundo, al igual que el resto de América Latina, inicie el fracasado proceso de industrialización por sustitución de importaciones y aborde un proceso que durará hasta 1976 de aislamiento del mundo. Valparaíso queda cesante, deja de ser el vibrante centro financiero que fue durante el 19 y temprano 20 y queda completamente reducido a ser simplemente el puerto de Santiago. No puedo negar la amargura que me genera el hecho de haber tenido que presentar exposiciones o conferencias en compañías navieras en Santiago con una magnífica vista a la cordillera, digamos, y recordar que Chile probablemente es el único país donde una compañía naviera mira las montañas, digamos. En esa situación nos encontramos con que los elementos determinantes de la economía chilena y su posición frente al mar continuaron siendo críticas durante el siglo XX, las exportaciones de cobre, la gran minería del cobre y sus vinculaciones durante la Guerra Fría, si bien es cierto nos protegieron en el sentido de estar en el hemisferio y océano equivocados, estábamos en el Pacífico, en el hemisferio sur, cuando todo se llevaba a cabo, como mencionaba el almirante Connell hace algunos momentos atrás, en el Atlántico Norte, digamos, de alguna parte viene el nombre de la NATO, nos encontramos con que en el siglo XXI la situación es exactamente inversa. Todos los que estamos dentro de esta sala hemos crecido presentándonos o leyendo del futuro del Océano Pacífico, del futuro del comercio marítimo. Bueno, señores, eso ya no es futuro, es presente y en más de algún sentido incluso pasado en términos de algunas estructuras exportadoras o algunas visiones particulares. En ese esquema, el desafío que nos encontramos hoy día es que Chile tiene nuevamente que no solamente conectarse comercialmente, como lo viene haciendo desde la década de los 70, 80 y 90, Chile tiene hoy día la mayor red de tratados de libre comercio con el mundo. Justo es decir que ese dato, estamos en permanente competencia con Singapur. Hay meses en que ellos están adelante, otros en que nosotros estamos. En este momento estamos nosotros con el 87,2% del PGB del mundo accesible a través de tratados de libre comercio, mientras que Singapur tiene el 84,8%, según datos actualizados el día lunes. En esa situación, los potenciales que esto nos ofrecen es que nos obliga a tomar actitudes proactivas y concretas respecto a la forma en la cual queremos ejercer esta visión. Y si bien es cierto, hemos superado el trauma del año 29 y del aislamiento de 50 años desde la perspectiva de las redes de comercio y de estructura, en otros sentidos seguimos recordando, como lo planteara algún presidente y lo repitió una presidenta, creyendo que somos un país pequeño al final del mundo. Eso era cierto cuando para llegar a Chile se necesitaban 3 meses de navegación y cruzar el Cabo de Hornos en un clipper. Pero cuando estamos a 12 horas en un Airbus, la verdad es de Europa, eso ya no es tal. Por lo tanto, y además, ya no somos un país pequeño solamente por tener los 19 millones de habitantes que tenemos, sino que tenemos elementos cualitativos que nos hacen interesantes en una serie de otras dimensiones. Por favor, no exageremos, no se trata que seamos una gran potencia ni que aspiremos a hacerlo, pero sí somos un país relevante en una serie de aspectos, algo que en muchos casos, desde la perspectiva tradicional del enfoque de las relaciones internacionales y de la historia política chilena, no es analizado o reconocido como tal. En ese sentido, nos encontramos con que la apertura de red de acuerdos comerciales chilenos nos lleva a que de facto seamos un país marítimo absoluto. No voy a repetir lo que muchos de los aquí presentes han planteado tantas veces, el volumen de dependencia de comercio marítimo, el hecho de que sin poder abastecer el libre acceso a energía, Chile en 5 días queda sin gas y una sucesión de otras circunstancias, sino que cómo tomarlo más que desde la perspectiva de la amenaza, desde la perspectiva de la proactividad y las oportunidades que esto nos ofrece, tanto para el involucramiento y participación en ambos aspectos o en ambas caras de lo que Mahan y Corbett nos recordaban como el Sea Power. En esa situación, y terminando ya en atención al tiempo, creo que es una de las pocas veces en mi carrera académica que he logrado ceñirme a los minutos del caso, es crítico recordar que la condición marítima de un Estado es multidimensional. En esa condición es tan fuerte como el eslabón más débil que tiene dentro de su estructura. Y por lo tanto, si bien es cierto, en algunos aspectos somos notablemente exitosos y eficientes en el desarrollo y en la sustentación de dichas capacidades, en otros aspectos somos bastante más erráticos y, como planteaba el almirante Connell, tenemos una dinámica de stop-start, de partir y terminar, que está generando visiones complejas, sobre todo cuando ya no somos un país de $1.500 de ingreso per cápita al final del mundo. En esa situación, la necesidad de una capacidad de proyección, no entendida solamente como una capacidad de proyección naval, sino que de acción general del Estado, lo que en términos angloparlantes vendría siendo una capacidad púrpura, incorporando también las distintas herramientas del mundo civil combinado con los aspectos navales, generan un desafío que es sencillamente formidable. Y en esto debemos insistir, que esto debe verse ya no como futuro, sino que como una exigencia inmediata del presente actual. Es algo que debimos haber tenido completo hasta ayer, o antes de ayer incluso, y en la cual por distintas circunstancias quizás hay algunos aspectos de esta visión global que se han ido ralentizando. Ese es el desafío que tenemos desde centros de estas características, desde reuniones de estas características, donde podamos ir debatiendo cómo vamos redondeando y balanceando estas circunstancias. Como en algún momento me planteara un brillante historiador naval, Mr. Norman Friedman, una de las claves de la visión naval chilena es que siempre está insatisfecha y disconforme con el nivel en que está. El hecho de que siempre considera de que falta un 5%, de que hay algo que se podría hacer mejor. Y nos presagiaba que el día en que comprendamos que tan mal no nos está yendo va a ser el inicio de nuestra ruina. En ese sentido, quizás recordar los aspectos incompletos que tenemos por delante sea quizás el mejor acicate para la continuación de ferias y exposiciones como esta o presentaciones sin duda considerablemente más interesantes y complejas que la que he podido hacer el día de hoy acá para ustedes. Muchas gracias por su atención, reitero el agradecimiento por la invitación. Muchísimas gracias.
Bueno, y después de esta interesante presentación de Fernando Wilson, los dejo a continuación con el señor Alessio Patalano, quien en estos breves días ha tenido la oportunidad de conocer más Chile, conocer la Marina desde una perspectiva histórica, que por supuesto la ha compartido aquí brillantemente Fernando Wilson, pero también ha tenido la oportunidad de conversar con muchos de ustedes, lo cual es muy importante, interiorizarse, le han contado qué hacen, cómo ven el mundo, cuáles son sus relaciones, y yo creo que se va a llevar una muy buena experiencia que algún día veremos traducida en algunos de sus brillantes libros que los invito a leer. Así que, sin más, dejo aquí a Alessio Patalano con ustedes. Gracias.
Excellent. Good to see you. Chief of Chilean Navy, flag officers, senior delegates, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank the Athena Lab and Juan Pablo for the unique opportunity to be here and engage with you. There's two things two challenges that sort of struck me right at the beginning. First of all was the question, the essay question that Juan Pablo was giving us. What does it mean to be a maritime power? That's no small order question. The other one was for me to realize that I was coming after an admiral, a second sea lord no less, and a very distinguished Chilean historian, both of whom were displaying part of their firepower with visual strike capabilities. So I decided that it would be a very difficult task to me, no matter what I was going to say, but at least I needed to do something brave. So I won't have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm just going with the sheer power, if you want, of my personal projection capacity. Now, it is a very big question. It's a very hard one, right? What does it mean to be a maritime power? I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all answer. And I will not try to provide you a one-size-fits-all. But at the same time, I do believe it is a crucial question, because the case of navies as part of the national infrastructure that delivers on national security, it's far from obvious. And I would completely agree with Admiral Noonan that it's never been as important as it is today to ask that question. So what I'll try to do is to follow on Sir Julian Corbett's footsteps and try to offer a few thoughts about some of the principles that should help us guiding how a country's elites can start to think about what it means to them to be a maritime power. And by the way, as an academic, it would be absolutely silly of me to come here and tell you about how navies should go about being maritime power. Certainly, I have troubles commanding my own children, so imagine trying to command ideas to fully grown-up military officers with long-standing experience. So instead, what I'm trying to do today is to provide a perspective to do what navies seldom actually do, which is try to develop a narrative, an argument, that allows the rest of a country's elite to engage with why it is important to be a maritime power. Telling naval officers that being maritime power is a cool thing ain't that complicated, right? And it shouldn't be to begin with. The question is, how do you get on board everybody else? Starting with diplomats, starting with local authorities, starting with MPs. So what I'll try to do over the next few minutes is to argue that we should aspire to present being sort of a maritime power as part of a national security grammar against which political and military elites develop policy actions to advance national security. Being maritime, and I'm looking at an Air Force officer that's saying this, so that's utterly bizarre. Right? Being a maritime power should be absolutely an inherent component of the way in which a country's elite think about how to connect the use of the sea for the pursuit of foreign policy and national security. In particular, as I try to articulate my principles of naval engagement, as it were, as an inherent part of the shared strategic fluency across departments of government to understand why what the Navy does in everyday activities matters to national security, I'll set also forth an idea, and that is that today we live in a maritime century which should inspire and make it easier for navies to communicate why their role matter nationally. What do I mean by living in a maritime century? The answer to this question is based on three interlinked reasons, some elements of which have already been mentioned today. So what I'll try to do, it's the classic academic trick, saying nothing really new, but presented in a very nice way. 3 points are, first, the ocean, as a general proposition, underwrites today's global physical and digital connectivity, bringing societies closer together by delivering the raw materials upon which the benefits of economic interdependence are ensured. And I'll come back to this point in a minute. The second element is that the sea remains and is indeed becoming an increasingly more important resource that demands concerted efforts to ensure its sustainable management and exploitation, inviting, as a result of that, responsible governance. Third, the ocean is the largest staging platform for the projection of capabilities that empower states or coalition with the choice to extend the use of force for the purpose of statecraft beyond their national boundaries. And to my mind, the first 2 points are the ones that truly are changing the way in which we should think about the relevance of being a maritime power in the 21st century. Because today, maritime connectivity, governance, and statecraft are a function of, and the drivers behind, modern prosperity. That's why the maritime matters, right? Because it changes, it informs, it helps developing the way we go about our lives on a daily basis. It is, of course, a well-known fact that 90% of global trade is carried by sea. Fine, we knew that. However, it is perhaps less well known that some 97% of the world's communications are delivered by 1.2 million kilometers of submarine cables. Every year, maritime transportation, both physical and digital, provides societies the world over with access to products and services that, as a former National Security Advisor, Stephen Lovegrove, once put it, previous generation could only have imagined. So next time you're talking to your friends about going about using your mobile phones, for your daily thing, when you're looking for a signal, the real thing is that you should point it that way, right? Because the majority of the data that enables that to happen is happening out there, not up there, right? Now, of no less significance, today the ocean accounts for more than half of the oxygen supporting human life, and it fuels the water cycle that deliver fresh water. It supports pioneering efforts to generate clean electricity, such as offshore wind technology, and is able to store more carbon per unit than forests. It is no exaggeration to argue that the ocean stands at the heart of any environmentally sustainable future life for humanity. Yet, as demands for ocean governance and unfolding from these functions increased, so have the opportunities for state actors, not merely those that can boast large navies, to exert degrees of maritime influence. That is because this notion extends today to law enforcement and constabulary missions, and as a result of this, is no longer the prerogative of major powers alone, but of any coastal state with the capacity to assert its claims. Less sophisticated or asymmetric capabilities are contributing to redefine regional order and operational balance through the contestation of maritime rights and their application. Some examples will probably be well known to you, and indeed will be somewhat familiar. Over the last couple of days, I've heard a number of times different Chilean officers referring to Chinese fishing fleets just outside your EEZ. That's the sort of contestation that matters, and it is part of how you define today being a maritime power. It has to be connected to it, because ensuring that a sustainable prosperity comes about it means also to engage with that. Indeed, in this maritime century, the ocean is a critical source of prosperity through connectivity and sustainable development. But for the reason it has also become a front line of geopolitical confrontation, one in which nations can show leadership or have it contested. They can enhance global governance or drive fragmentation and assertion of sovereign competing rights. It is the place in which the exercise of some forms of influence to pursue national prosperity can sustain a stable international order or plants the seeds to unravel it. So that goes for the first question. Why do we live in a maritime century and why that matters in making the case? And for me, the key lesson to take away is that we need to start thinking about the ocean not only as a space from where we project, contest, acquire, control, and national hard power or soft power, but it's also a resource in itself that is becoming increasingly contested internationally. And how we assert and protect that environment will say something about our capacity to continue to prosper, live, survive through the maintenance of governance in sea and order. But what does that mean in terms of national security? What are the implications of a maritime century for national security? The cooperative version here regards to the extension of the link between maritime affairs and national security beyond matters of power projection and sea control. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that in the age of competition, these things don't matter. Of course they do. But I also knew that I was coming after two admirals who would talk about that, so they made my life a lot easier. In 20 minutes, I can focus on the other bit of this story. Because these have consequences. The infrastructure and underpinning modern maritime connectivity is a clear example of the limits of today's resilience. And I would argue that the implications of being a maritime power from a national security perspective not only are in terms of the capacity to contest and fight in the kinetic space, given where we are, but it is also about pursuing greater degrees of resilience and integration with other levers of national power. Let me talk about resilience for a minute. Disruptions to shipping created during the pandemic, and the more recent blockade of the Black Sea, and the subsequent disruption of grain from Ukraine have emphasized how such disruptions to the movement of raw materials in one part of the world have effects well beyond the boundaries of its immediate neighborhood. By a similar token, damage sustained by the pipelines Nord Stream 1 and 2 linking Russia to Germany has exposed the vulnerability of energy supplies to state actors with the means to operate effectively underwater. Relatedly, digital connectivity also stands quite vulnerable on its own terms. Submarine cables can be interfered with, damaged, or indeed cut, with significant economic losses, which can be exponentially more impactful on economies relying on single cables for their connective capacity. Think, for example, what happened in 2017, when a single cable that was accidentally cut off the coast of Somalia by a ship anchor. The internet outage lasted approximately 3 weeks, and it cost the country approximately $10 million each day. On that occasion, the consequences were not purely economic, since the internet outage complicated efforts to combat a nationwide drought that had half of the population in need of assistance. And indeed, you can add to this, this was a natural disaster, but more recently in the UK, we've seen what happened with the lack of connectivity of the Shetland Islands that, for all intents and purposes, seems to be man-made rather than natural-made. So that element of connectivity, both above the surface of the water as well underneath it, that fuels our prosperity, that defines our capacity for resilient economic prosperity, stands challenged. The normative dimension of maritime resilience requires addressing the question of good order at sea. This starts with ensuring the respect of the principles of freedom of navigation, as they are enshrined in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but it also demands assessing how state actors use the sea to connect societies and project influence to ensure a sustainable marine environment. Today, more than a third of the world's fisheries are on the brink of collapse, and sea level rises threaten the disappearance of island nations. What we need to tackle that matters to an enormous amount of people. That should be how we engage over the definition of being a maritime power. Make no mistake, in a maritime century in which the maritime order fuels so much of our prosperity, the vulnerabilities of the international order, as I described it, naturally lend themselves to be exploited by authoritarian regimes. And you just need to look at what happened over the last 9 months in Europe around the war in Ukraine to get a sense of it. Because authoritarian regimes possess the means and crucially the capacity to control the different levers of national power in an integrated fashion that perhaps democracies do not possess, to exploit the fragility and inherent vulnerability of the maritime order to advance their domestic agendas. They deploy different military, paramilitary and non-military tools of statecraft to assert national power and claim rights, to increase regional influence or limit other actors' maritime connectivity and projection capacity. They can coordinate or sequentially link different tools with applications across issues of connectivity and resilience in the maritime domain. Their actions represent a clear systemic challenge to a peacetime order and stability that are not all that peaceful after all. So part of this story here is about how we need to think about being a maritime power, not just as being ready to deter or indeed fight if push comes to shove, but it's also how to ensure that the resilience and the vulnerabilities of the international order that fuel our daily prosperities are not at the mercy of state actors that can mobilize their tools and levers of national power to undermine them and hijack our capacity to have a choice in international affairs. Right. So, in a maritime century in which national security and maritime, sort of being a maritime power, are linked together in the way I've just described, what should be the principles to inform the naval engagement that is desirable and that should be part of a common and shared grammar across departments of government? So this isn't about navies. This is about everybody else outside the box of navies. This should be the sort of things like that if you talk with someone from a different service or indeed the diplomatic corps, should be able to tell you right away what being a maritime power is about. Now, how do you define that? There's 3 principles I think are important to keep in mind. All right? And again, let me re-emphasize, this is about creating a shared strategic fluency across government over why and how using the Navy on a daily basis matters to national security. Mind you, my emphasis is on this because most navies, 90% of the time, perhaps even more, don't actually fight with each other, right? They are about preserving order. So emphasizing the peace value of navies as much as what they can contribute in a wartime condition is just as important of that picture of becoming and being a maritime power. So for relevant forms of naval engagement to be implemented, and therefore definitions of maritime power to be developed, I think civilian military elites in governments will have to develop a shared understanding of the 3 pillars, of the 3 P of naval statecraft: platforms, posture, and power. And statecraft here is intended as the capacity to use military means across the maritime domain to advance foreign and security policy objectives. So the first point, the first principle, right, points to an often neglected truth about the main delivery platform of naval engagement, the warship. Let's celebrate it for a second, beyond being a pretty thing on a picture. Warships, here it comes, are more than mere combat platforms. A warship is a floating reproduction and scale of a nation state and the political ideals and social principles informing its sense of sovereignty. Everything from a design of a ship, where you put your galleys, whether you've got a wine cellar or a number of bakeries if you're on a French ship, it says something about, it reproduces the social structures and ideals and values that the society embraces. They are a floating embodiment of national space for international interactions. They are statements of national value and what they stand for. Their existence and daily operations take a state's political standing at the heart of the maritime order from the moment they leave port and when overseas, even when they set anchor in foreign destinations. Next door, you'll know and you'll see what 99% of the time people talk about when thinking about warships and naval assets, platforms, capabilities. In this room, it's the muscle behind that capability. That muscles that define what is the difference between a Chilean naval gun and a British naval gun or an American naval gun. That element of soft tissue connectivity, that is the unique first principle that should become an absolute sort of hardcore element of the shared grammar. The different departments of government and beyond the boundaries of government should be made absolutely central. This leads to a second point, the second principle. Naval statecraft is more than the sum of its activities. I always love when navies go around and present the stuff they do because they have these nicely boxes, you know, like fishery patrol, naval diplomacy. It's all like nice little box, right? Which, however, I think kind of fails to deliver the bigger picture in that sense. Because the effectiveness of naval statecraft rests on the existence of a clearly articulated worldview that offers the broader framework within which individual activities and initiatives become intelligible. It's not just listing the activities that matters, but presenting the overarching framework that makes those activities absolutely clear to your intended audience, whether military or otherwise. Such a vision is essential to allow existing allies and partners to understand and support a government's naval strategy, and prospective partners to appreciate their appeal and relevance. I'll give you an example that I'm familiar with. Japan's Free and Open Indo-Pacific initiative, which I'm sure here in Chile is as well understood, stands as a very good example of a wider policy vision that includes a worldview and values that inform why Japan does the stuff it does across the Indo-Pacific. And that matters because there's just so many times that the Chinese can go around and say like, yeah, look at what they're doing, not really nice. And people say like, no, dude, no. Because that is about prosperity. It's about an open architecture. It's about open economies. So how you present the core of your activities within the context of a broader framework matters just as much as the number of activities one conducts. Now, in this respect, the posture in forming naval engagement should be a statement about how a country views the balance between warfare or security and stability missions. The former speaks to mission predominantly aimed at maintaining the latter speaks to mission predominantly aimed at ensuring the safe connectivity and good management of the oceans. The latter, the former, related to the activities designed to support the freedom of navigations, alliance reassurance, or indeed the training and capacity and capabilities building for deterrence and war. So here, how you frame that broader concept really depends on the balance of mission in that spectrum that links constabulary to the warfare. All of it, it's about statecraft. Remember the triangle, Ken Booth, military, constabulary, and diplomatic? The diplomatic doesn't happen just one time. It happens all the time. So we need to think about this in a different way. In the future, understanding how different platforms can deliver on selected aspects of this wider canvas of options will allow, if supported by a wider strategic narrative about their meaning, to maximize effects, even with limited remote resources. This leads to my last point today. Naval statecraft is more than the sum of aggregated power of available capabilities. Different capabilities may provide wider or narrower ranges of political choice to governments depending on the specific circumstances they are presented with. A submarine deployed on patrol in a specific area can be perceived as a reassuring presence, or the opposite, depending on the context, and depending if one knows that the submarine is there. An offshore patrol vessel, at the opposite end of the spectrum, might seem like an inconsequential asset in a context in which other actors display heavier and more armed vessels. But that's not necessarily the case. Because if the main issue to deal with is security operations such as piracy, fishery patrol, or indeed the stability of the norms of freedom of navigation, presence as opposed to massive firepower, might very well remain extremely relevant. And that is certainly, for example, the case of the UK's OPVs forward deployed in the Indo-Pacific, whereby the consistent nature of their engagement in the region is part of the key elements and capacity to deliver in the broader statement of the UK, meaning being in the Indo-Pacific. This is because amity and confrontation are inherent to a warship at any time, and its firepower and self-sustainability define for how long and how far a ship can perform all of these functions. Above all, depending on the specific context, a warship can impress or show restraint, showcase industrial prowess, or highlight environmental sustainability. It can provide disaster relief or signal more coercive kind of capacity and intent. In the contested space of this maritime century, presence as an act of persistent engagement is what matters crucially. Everything else is relative to the specific context in which the asset is operating. So in all, in an international landscape in which state actors are taking conflict, cooperation, and confrontation to the seas, and the ocean is gaining center stage in society's ability to build a prosperous and sustainable future, having a shared grammar across different departments of government of what naval engagement presents as a tool of statecraft is one fundamental way in which governments can choose to matter. And becoming or being a maritime power stops being just a purely naval concept and it becomes a national security asset. Getting strategic fluency among elites on how these principles apply to them. And as I said, I just laid out the fundamental guiding basic principles. How you mix and match them, that depends on a number of different other factors that should be part of a national conversation. And I'm certainly here not to tell you that. So getting started on that strategic fluency among elites about how this principle should apply to them, regardless of the choices that a government makes in the end, represent perhaps the first crucial step on that journey. And above all, that means also that being a maritime power does not mean to be a big naval power. You can be a great maritime power without necessarily being a big maritime power. On this note, I'll thank you very much and look forward to your question. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Alessio, por tu brillante presentación. Creo que hemos tenido en el curso de la mañana distintos enfoques que vamos a discutir ahora en profundidad, aquí sentados con los panelistas. Por lo visto, en la escuadra se emocionó tanto cuando empezó a hablar Alessio de los buques que empezó a disparar. Así que lo que escucharon ustedes fueron, la verdad, salvas de honor, porque hoy día es el cambio de mando en la escuadra. Así que fue eso una muestra de nuestro poder marítimo. La verdad que quisimos dejarlo en claro, así que para todos los presentes. Así que eso que escuchaban, para que nadie se asuste, fue básicamente las cosas que están pasando. Como decía Alessio, las armadas, ¿cierto?, son esenciales en la guerra en el mar, pero también contribuyen mucho en tiempo de paz y tienen por supuesto, sus rituales y sus acciones. Y como bien explicaba, algunas están ocurriendo acá al frente, como ustedes pueden oír o ver, y otras están ocurriendo de forma permanente. En este momento hay gente que está fiscalizando, ¿cierto?, los mares, está realizando operaciones de ayuda humanitaria, trasladando gente, y eso es lo que ha sido recurrente. Y la idea ahora es, yo voy a hacer unas breves preguntas a los invitados en función de lo que han sido sus exposiciones, y de ahí culminamos a las 12. Carolina nos va a decir un poco más lo que viene después de cuando cerremos el panel. Así que, por favor, Admiral Connell, Alessio, Fernando, please. We are going to start the panel over here. Are you okay? Okay. My first question is for Admiral Connell. You mentioned today the importance of alliances. You say that it's not an option to go in solo or alone these days, and the Ukraine war proved that point. So my question is, what opportunities offers the UK tilts to the Indo-Pacific to increase partnerships or alliances these days for countries, Chile or different countries across the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I think the importance of bilateral Navy-to-Navy relationships. All of our navies, to varying degrees, have bilateral relationships. They're important and they're all different. And we can build on those depending on how much those partnerships matter. But of course, that's not the only nature of those Navy-to-Navy relationships. There are multilateral organizations for the United Kingdom. The bedrock of our security is founded on NATO. The alliance there, we've reinforced that recently in policy terms. And the extent to which we contribute forces to NATO, so for example, our national nuclear deterrent is attributed to NATO, as is our carrier strike group. And that is enshrined in an attack on one nation is an attack on all. So we have to be prepared to respond wherever that crisis might be. And then finally, there are a whole bunch of regional and multinational relationships that matter. So we have a Five Eyes relationship that we share our most cherished intelligence with those nations. We have regional Five Powers Defence Agreement. We have the Joint Expeditionary Force. So there are a number of regional collaborative entities that we can work with as well. So my point is, it's not just one size, it's multi-dimensional.
Thank you. Fernando, you mentioned that you say that the boldness or the strongness of a maritime vision depends on its weakest link. What is the weakest link in the Chilean maritime vision?
A tough question in its own. Oh, sorry. It's a tough question in its own right, but in many sense might be the lack of a political continuity in terms of the support of a broader maritime vision from the part of the Santiago-based direction in our country. There are broad, continuous maritime outlooks that, for instance, maritime trade, energy links, etc., that are continuous. But perhaps a more resilient and continuous approach, such as the one that has begun to be shown in regards to the national interest related to Antarctica, might be an interesting approach into that. Just as there is an Antarctic agenda, there could be a sea or a maritime agenda regarding the Chilean insertion into maritime affairs worldwide. Mm-hmm.
Fernando. Admiral Noonan, during your presentation, you show a very interesting slide about the different countries that are around Australia, and you show Antarctica. What is the role of Antarctica in the Indo-Pacific governance? Because when we compare different strategies towards the Indo-Pacific from different countries, basically we find different maps. But at the end appears the Antarctica. So what is the role of the Antarctica in the Indo-Pacific governance or vision, in your opinion?
Thank you, Juan Pablo. That's a great question and a very complex one. As we all know, there are a number of claimant states that claim parts of Antarctica, and there are a number of international conventions that govern activities that occur in Antarctica. I put that out there to start the conversation, and then obviously there are the resource implications of what's largely undiscovered and arguably ungoverned in the Antarctic region. The Australian claim in the region is a modest one when it gets to Antarctica itself. We have some offshore territories down towards Heard and McDonald Island which generate an exclusive economic zone, which in itself is an interesting one in that it's a very fertile biosecurity area, large fishing stocks, which have in the past been exploited by others. And part of underpinning being a maritime power is having the ability to enforce your country's sovereignty, particularly in offshore territories. Now, for us to send a frigate from Western Australia to Heard Island takes almost as long as it does for you to send a frigate from here to Hawaii. And if you don't have that ability and you don't enforce your sovereignty, you have to question whether or not you're able to enforce that sovereignty. And if you don't enforce that sovereignty or that claim, others will exploit it. And so looking at Antarctic in its role in the Indo-Pacific, I think it is almost a new frontier in terms of defining the international rules-based order, respecting sovereignty, preserving resources, preserving the environment, and we could have a whole new debate about global warming and the effect that is having in the Antarctic region. But it is a very, very important region. It's very complex, and it has state actors from the Northern Hemisphere who not only stake, but continue to grow their presence and their claims in the region. And I think we need to strive universally for transparency in what other states are doing in the Antarctic. In many cases, it's not just as simple as research.
Thank you, Admiral. Alessio, you are a professor at one of the best universities in the UK. You teach about maritime studies or naval studies. And you mentioned many times the role of the elites. What is the importance of education in the sense that we can avoid sea blindness or teach young generation the importance of the sea or to develop a maritime vision?
Right, so thank you. I certainly would not disagree with that, because that would be undermining my entire profession. So I agree strongly with the premise behind the question, but I can say this much. So King's, in particular, has one very peculiar characteristics within the landscape of London universities. And London is a very peculiar environment in itself. We have the largest concentration of top 25 universities in the world of any other city in the world. We have more top 25 universities in the same square miles than Cambridge, Massachusetts does, right? So that brings in itself a unique ecosystem of students coming from all over the place. So to begin with, I would say you're absolutely right. When it comes from a perspective from London, first thing to say is that London is a very privileged still, however long, I don't know, but we still are, thankfully, a good place for having that conversation with elites the world over. Because as both Admiral Noonan and the Second Sea Lord mentioned earlier on, cooperative forms of endeavours are becoming increasingly more the rule on how we get about the business of maintaining maritime order. So there is one first point that from a purely London selfish perspective, having elites that come from across the world allows that conversation to be a shared conversation across elites. So the first thing is, depending where you are, trying to draw advantage of this very important point of education of elites. In London, one of the key advantages is 60% of all postgraduate students are from any place other than the UK. At times, depends on programs, down to 70%. That's the first thing. The second thing is universities are what I would encourage, and this is something that is starting to emerge, and I think it's an important development, precisely to achieve that objective of widening the outreach towards elites in a broader sense. Universities are starting to develop programs that are not just designed to be the traditional postgraduate sort of MAs or PhDs. These programs take an awful lot of time. So particularly navies, which have relatively small manpower sort of personnel ratio to activities, it's very hard to pull out anyone for a year or 2 years, if not more, which ends up being, navies tend to have the least educated, certainly in the UK, some of the sort of lower level of education at the postgraduate level compared to, say, for example, their sister services in the Army or in the Air Force, right? So at the moment, universities do recognize the significance of the drain that such a long period of time takes, and they started to develop executive-oriented type of shorter courses, about 3 to 4 weeks, whereby what you do, you just try to present elites from different departments of government, including the military, with the opportunity, albeit in a shorter time, to be exposed to these ideas and start that conversation among themselves. So the second point, from a purely sort of UK perspective, is that thinking about how to become more creative on education that reaches out very busy elites in the contemporary world, that's another way to sort of have that sort of wider shared grammar to develop. And the third thing is ensuring that there is a constant engagement between civil service, armed forces, and policy elites and academia. That's not a natural feature. In the United States, it's much more natural because of the revolving door system. Certainly in the UK, now it's starting to become slightly more regular, but that kind of interaction does help because the academic will come in with some outlandish and very impractical ideas at times, but sometimes that's exactly what elites need in order to improve their thinking and how to implement policy. So 3 things. Look where you are from your vantage point and see how you can maximize that. In our case, the international exposure. 2, be creative about the educational offering that you can create. That really sort of allows to have more elites engaged. 3, try to increase, in any case, regardless of the educational offer, the capacity to engage and interact with academics. That will allow you to get a better sense of people, how people out there think about this stuff, if at all, and try to act upon it.
Thank you, Alessio. This question goes for both admirals. Australia and the UK are building fantastic ships, new ones. You showed some pictures. Can you explain the benefits of a naval construction plant, not only for the navies, for the whole society? Are you creating jobs? Are you reaching new capabilities in terms of technology? That is the question. What are the benefits for the whole country if you start to building your own ships in your place?
So perhaps I'll start and Mike can build on from an Australian perspective. We've established a national shipbuilding office in the United Kingdom. It just so happens that the Defence Secretary is the shipbuilding SAR, the lead within government on that aspect. And we have now a multi-decade pipeline approach to shipbuilding. I think that's really important to give confidence to industry about the continuity and investment. I think it's important that we build the skills, because if I won the lottery and decided to buy more warships tomorrow, we haven't got the capacity. You've got to build that capacity. It takes time. So it's got to be sustainable, and by sustainable, you've got to be able to project forward what the order book looks like. I think that's particularly important. And then, as I mentioned earlier on, I think we as navies have to be much clearer about what any political direction of travel is. What is the ambition for regional prosperity? What's the Navy's role in that? Because I might have a desire to go shopping and buy something overseas, but actually it might be important to invest closer to home and have something that is good enough. And so we need to understand that political intent. We need to articulate what our needs are as a Navy far enough in advance, and sometimes we're not that good at that. And then it needs to be able to deal with economic shocks. We've got to avoid the stop-start element. In shipbuilding, I mean, our history tells us people planted oak trees for future generations. Today's challenge is how do we plant a similar acorn that will invest in tomorrow's Navy?
Noonan.
Thank you. And my comments would be very similar to those of Martin's. Australia's program is very similar. We've taken a long-term approach with the National Shipbuilding Plan because we've learnt the same lessons, not just from the UK but from others, where we are actually in our 5th iteration of a national shipbuilding capacity. We've typically, over the last 200 years, built a bunch of ships and then stopped. And then what we've created has been termed as a valley of death that industry has then had to navigate, regenerate capacity, and then move forward. You might argue that we're slow learners, that we've done this 5 times before we've realised that we have to have a continuous plan, but that's what we're now committed to. And it follows on the heels of some significant changes in the Australian industrial landscape. We used to have 5 major automobile producers in Australia. Now we have 0. Every car that's sold in Australia now is typically assembled, designed and shipped to Australia. We obviously maintain vehicles. So we've had a large industrial workforce that has spread itself far and wide. The oil and gas industry's picked up a lot of those, but now we're saying that in order to maintain a strong defence capability, we have to make it a sovereign capability. Martin's described capacity within the UK. It's the same in the US. There's simply an inability for Australia as a growing defence nation to rely on others to provide our long-term capability. Your questions around what does it mean nationally? So directly, we've got around about 5,000 people involved in building ships in Australia today. The follow-on industries that are supporting that industry rounds out to around about 40,000 people. As we move forward, and the extension of the Type 26 program is the Hunter class program in Australia. We're building 9 frigates. We cut steel on the first of those next year, and it will be a very similar ship to the Type 26. So we're drawing heavily on lessons, technology, and expertise that's resident within the UK, the Royal Navy, and obviously BAE. And over time, we will transfer that expertise to Australia. I have deliberately not spoken very much about submarines today. When I was the Chief of Navy, I used to say that I would speak about submarines every day, and I did, and I'm not a submariner. But what we will need to do over the next 20 years, as we move from a conventionally powered submarine fleet to a fleet of 10 to a dozen nuclear-powered submarines, is moved from a submarine enterprise of around about 1,500 people to probably over 7,000. And that's going to take a long time. So creating jobs sounds attractive. It's very attractive politically to talk about creating jobs, particularly in regional areas. But you've also got to think of that against the national climate and the national landscape. In Australia currently, we are very lucky. We have an unemployment rate of less than 4% of the population. Yet we are seeking to grow not only our shipbuilding industry by a factor of 5 to 10, we're also seeking to grow our Navy from 15,000 to 20,000. At the same time, the Army and the Air Force are seeking to grow, as are a number of the national security services. And the biggest area of growth probably in Australia now is cyber and cyber expertise. And so all of the things that I've described are very deeply rooted in technical expertise, software integration, cyber, where we've just established a space command in Australia. And we are competing for a very, very niche and highly prized talent pool when it comes to graduates and the future. And so one of the things that is very important, and this is not just in Australia, it's globally, it's developing talent, and particularly smart young people who understand STEM, science, technology, maths, and there has been a drifting away from that, certainly in Australia over the last 20 to 30 years. But we have to reinvest in talent because we simply cannot generate the talent that we need now and certainly into the future by relying on what we've got now. We've got to reinvigorate STEM, and we've got to take a more global view of how we transfer talent for short-term or long-term, be that through immigration or be that through exchanges. And I'm very grateful of the way that we have within our navies been able to exchange talent very successfully over the last 50 plus years, but we need to upscale that to a national level.
Excellent. This one goes to Alessio. Well, you mentioned ships or warships. You say that they are not only platforms, the ships transmit a vision of the country. Yesterday, you went to Talcahuano, to the smart shipyards, and you visited the new icebreaker. Could you share your impression of what kind of Chilean vision you figure out for that ship?
So one of the impressive features was the capacity, the accommodation, and how it reflects on the extended sort of capacity for staying power, if you want, once deployed in the Antarctic, as well as the capacity to conduct marine research and science activities. And I think that's a very important point, and it says something about how articulating being a maritime power for a country like Chile, because from what I can see, geography links Chile very much, very closely to that stability of the international maritime order, as I was sort of pointing it out earlier, this idea that it's a place that needs to be protected for us to exploit it and use it in a sustainable fashion. And so the icebreaker really gives this idea that navies are more than just the combat experience or the preparation or the capacity to engage operate. Navies also have a very important role to play in how we create a sustainable future in which the ocean that already underwrites prosperity and the pursuit of prosperity will continue to do so in a way that is acceptable. It also becomes a very important source of potential international cooperation, precisely because places like the polar regions are likely to become more contested, but also likely to remain very central to the answers about a sustainable future. It presents an opportunities for all sorts of other actors and partners to actually contribute in research and science-related activities in order to understand these places better, in order to develop and formulate the answers to address how to sustainably access and exploit these environments in a long-term future. So, yes, of course, it's not as fancy as it could be a frigate or a submarine or indeed a carrier. But at the same time, I don't think it's any less a powerful statement of where Chile is, why Chilean maritime power matters, and how regionally it can become also an attracting beacon for other partners to work together with Chile on this very important issue. Let alone the fact that on Thursday you can learn about the empanadas, which is a lovely sort of cultural element attached to it.
Well, thank you, Alessio. We are on time, estamos en el tiempo. Lamento no poder hacer más preguntas a Fernando Wilson, pero tenemos la suerte de tenerlo acá, ¿no? Así que ustedes lo pueden contactar de forma más regular. Así que les voy a pedir un aplauso para los panelistas. Thank you, gentlemen.